Welcome to our third community forum with Inclusive Lafayette. We are really delighted to have Conor Dougherty talk about his experience as an economics reporter and also talk about his book. Before we get started, I would like to briefly introduce Inclusive Lafayette for anyone who is new or anyone who wants to refresh their memory. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. So, hi everyone, Inclusive Lafayette, here we go. Inclusive Lafayette is a grassroots organization. We are committed to promoting social justice in our town. We were originally founded in the wake of the George Floyd protests, and our mission is to encourage inclusivity in Lafayette through affordable, sustainable housing and land use policies. So one of the things that we like to touch on a lot is the difference between multifamily and single family housing. And we talk about multifamily housing because it's actually the best way to have a lot of affordable housing in one place because you have higher density and it can come in many different forms beyond just duplexes, apartment buildings and condos. It can also be on top of storefronts, and it can be 2 floors, 3 floors, but you don't really notice how tall they are just by walking by. And the majority of Lafayette is single family housing, which means single homes on single lots. And 83% of residential land in the Bay Area is zoned for single family housing. So that's quite a lot. We also get asked why housing is a pathway for inclusivity, and part of that is because of our history of discriminatory housing policies in the United States. Discriminatory federal housing policies started in 1934, and that included redlining and restrictive covenants, which were racial covenants that only allowed white people to live in certain areas. These policies restricted the accumulation of wealth through home equity to white families. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed in an effort to eliminate these discriminatory housing policies. But housing in Lafayette is unfortunately no exception to discriminatory housing policies and exclusionary zoning policies. There are implicit tools of exclusion that we use even after the Fair Housing Act, which are restrictive building codes and zoning. This leads to a very stagnant population over the last 50 years, and Lafayette being one of the most racially segregated and least diverse cities in the Bay. So after that brief history, I just wanted to say that I'm really excited to hear from Conor Dougherty about how the housing crisis affects all of California and the rest of the country. And I'm also really looking forward to hearing from Jeremy Levine, our director, and our later moderator of the Q&A.
So I'll take over now and hand the mic over to Conor and let him introduce himself and start off his story of how he got involved with housing policy in California and eventually came to Lafayette.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Thanks everyone for being here. It's funny how many book talks I've given. When the book came out, I thought I would just do, a short tour and that was it. And then COVID happened and people asked me to do things on Zoom, and I feel like I've been, I've done, I don't know, 100 or something Zoom events, and they're all so fun. So I feel like I've had this whole new life in this kind of book since COVID. And if COVID hadn't happened, I wonder if that would have happened. So I'm not happy COVID happened, but it has added this whole new dimension, and being able to talk to so many different people and really even small gatherings that I might not have been able to do otherwise. So it's really great to be here. I'm Conor. I'm from the Bay Area. I grew up mostly in San Francisco, went to high school in Napa Valley, moved away, went to college in San Diego, lived in LA, lived in New York, and moved home I guess in 2014, and I moved home because maybe this is too much, but my mom had Alzheimer's and I wanted to be closer to home. And I guess that kind of got me thinking about housing because I felt like I was both a newcomer and a local at the same time. You know, I'd been out of the Bay Area for quite a long time. And when I moved here, it was like coming back to a place that was familiar, but also different. And when I got home, it was right after the Google bus protest, or maybe that happened shortly after I got here, but it was right around that time. And just everything felt so angry. The Bay Area housing has always been something people have talked a lot about. Home prices have always been very high. If you go to a party, you know, as a kid, you would like hear adults talking about home prices. That's just like, you know, it's sort of in the water here. So I don't want to say it's completely new, but it felt like it had like reached a new level. And then of course, when you go to LA, I don't know if anyone here's been to LA in a while, but I mean, the Bay Area's homeless problem looks very minor compared to what it looks like when you go to LA. You go to LA and you think, oh, the Bay Area, wow, they're doing so great on this homeless problem. And you know, I'm half kidding, but I mean, it is considerably worse there, and it's very visible and very, I think, you know, basically a small city. It's like 60-something thousand people live outside. So of course, I wanted to know more about this, and I wanted to start to think about this. And I was covering economics. And what was interesting to me is a lot of economists and academics had been talking about California having a housing shortage, and that this being a huge source of its housing woes, whether it's on the very bottom where you see, you know, actual homelessness, or at the top where you see, you know, pretty upper class people having trouble buying a new home. You know, the median home price is $800,000. And of course that sounds like steel in the Bay Area. Anyway, so people had been writing about this for as far back as the 70s. And these are not fringe people. This is like, you know, economists at Berkeley. It's also not a particularly partisan problem. George H.W. Bush had a whole report spearheaded by Jack Kemp over the quote unquote NIMBY problem. If you can go look that up in the H.W. Bush presidential archives. Clinton had something similar. Obama had something, and even Trump had something until he sort of weirdly he literally signed something called the YIMBY Act, and then a year later basically went against it. But that was like a sort of anyway, my point is it didn't seem like a particularly controversial thing. And I would guess I just became very interested in if there's this sort of consensus, one that's not particularly political, around this is sort of a problem, and here is a very obvious solution. Why is it so hard to implement that solution? Now, I realize it's not that simple, but they're, you know, generally speaking, you would think the details could work themselves out. And so I guess in my mind, that was sort of the story of the book, which was, here's this problem that's been very obvious for, you know, my entire life. And all these different kinds of people have tried to solve the difficulty of living in the Bay Area with housing for a long time, and but they're all having so much trouble. Let's just watch them beat their heads against the wall. And I kind of thought, in a way, that would be the book. So I tried to sort of find different sorts of people on different sides of the problem. So one of the main characters of the book is this woman, Sonia Trouse, who has probably become somewhat known in Lafayette, but I actually met her before she got involved in Lafayette. And, you know, she was this kind of, to me, this kind of represented a new kind of activist who was trying to fight for more density and fight for more housing, which is not a platform I'd ever heard before. And then, you know, I spent a lot of time with a family while they were evicted. I went to a kind of like a tenant help place. You know, when people are having trouble with rent and whatnot, they went to this community center. I just kind of hung out there until I found a family that said they wanted to talk to me, and they're very invested in this idea that they wanted to expose this landlord kicking them out. And I spent several months with them while they sort of got this $800 rent increase. There's a 15-year-old girl comes home one day and finds an $800 rent increase attached to the door of her apartment. Basically has to like stop school, become like a full-time activist to sort of keep her family from becoming homeless. They ultimately have this huge groundswell and try to create a tenants union, but are ultimately unsuccessful. And sort of, so I thought that would be, okay. Anyway, and then I ended up in Lafayette. And I guess I thought Lafayette was interesting for a couple reasons. One was, sorry, not right now. Okay, great. Sorry, you knew that was going to happen, but it finally happened. So I was interested in looking at different kinds of places. And I guess in my mind, I kind of thought to myself, wouldn't it be fun to just unpack one region? Go to, the place where very low income workers live and sort of see their situation, and go to a wealthier place and see what housing looks like there, and go to a young, meet young professionals and just sort of, rather than going around the nation and trying to figure out, different sort of large regions, just kind of like unpack one region and try to capture the, economic stratification within it. Anyway, the reason I picked Lafayette was, as I told Jeremy today, a little bit probably more narrative than anything else. I knew that Lafayette had this big fight over the terraces, which we don't necessarily have to get into, but, and I could sort of see that it was concluding one way or the other within the timeline of when I was going to do the book, and finding a narrative that would have something like an end, even though I'm sure many people don't believe the terraces has quite yet ended. Anyway, I just thought that would be an interesting way to do it. It felt like I could actually come there and see this thing as it was happening, but I also knew it would have a resolution. I guess the reason I also thought Lafayette was interesting is this. We live in a region, and as an economics reporter, I have always thought of regions as regions. And, when I talk about Houston or Detroit or New York or even smaller places like Minneapolis, when I think of these places, I don't really think of the city as, the place. I think of the whole region and the sort of economic kind of base it sort of entails. And it's funny, I mean, when I say city, I sort of just use it interchangeably with metro area. And most people live in a metro area in America. If you want to live in a truly rural place, there's not that many people in America who live in a really rural place. But if you do want to do that, you can find that at very low cost. So I guess I thought Lafayette was interesting because because through BART and the 24 freeway, which were both built in the Pat Brown era, which was something that was like important to me because I wrote about kind of the big growth of California in that era. And then the backlash to it, Lafayette sort of fit pretty well within those bookends. And I guess I thought that, you have this BART stop. BART is, probably more than $1 billion a mile at today's rates. And there's not that much by it, which is sort of surprising if you think about it. If you go to, any city or country that has like a really, really, really well-traveled rail system, it's usually pretty dense around the stops. And I think the thinking there is that if you're going to spend $1 billion per mile on something, you probably want to make sure it's getting a high utilization rate. So anyway, Jeremy sort of told me not to talk about the terraces, so I'm having a hard time right now. But I thought that the fight, and I guess I also thought one of the other things, this gets like into a sort of, I don't know how many people here have read the book, but the point of the book is to sort of write narratively about the housing crisis. Zoning can be a very dry topic, and whereas housing doesn't necessarily have to be a dry topic, right? I mean, when people pick up their newspaper or their magazine, they love reading about housing. They want to read about fancy homes. They want to read about home prices. They like reading about tiny homes. They love design. I mean, there's so many different kinds of ways people love reading about the spaces we live. But when you get into the sort of nitty-gritty policy of it, it does get kind of boring. So I kind of thought it would be fun to write a book where you had characters who want something. I think all good novels, not that I'm comparing myself to that, but I'd like to think that I tried to borrow some of those methods. All good novels are sort of about someone sort of trying to get something that they really want. And so I tried to find characters that wanted something, whether they want some kind of political power, or they want to build something, or they want to not get evicted, or there's like a very tangible goal. And then I tried to find stories that interlock with each other. So you have like the Sonia person who's often one kind of journey at the beginning of the book, and then she sort of pops up in Lafayette and then pops up again, and that way you sort of give readers a little bit of an anchor to hold on to in the middle of all this discussion of zoning and affordable housing and all that. Anyway, so that's kind of how I came to the book, and that was how I was thinking about it, and how I ultimately got to Lafayette, which is that it sort of seemed like an interesting place because it's a suburb, but it's a suburb that's not that far from San Francisco. So it's not like it's, Antioch or something. And it has this, very expensive resource that's kind of a regional resource. If you want to go to the airport, it's funny, and I'll just leave you with this. And this is kind of an open question, right? Somebody asked me once, well, shouldn't the people in a neighborhood have a lot of say over what's going there? And I was like, sure, yeah. But like, if you drive to San Francisco every day and hang out in an office building, should the people who live near and there be able to sort of dictate, you're sort of dictating what's happening in their neighborhood by virtue of your actions. You know what I mean? That like, it gets kind of sketchy. Like if you had one BART stop and nothing on the other side, it would be pretty useless, right? Like it wouldn't get you to the airport. It would be like, so I think I try to think about it sometimes in terms of that train where we really do operate as one region. We operate, through transit and all these different things. And ultimately, that's what binds us. And I feel like our housing policy is not reflecting that. And exactly how we get through that is the political journey that California is now on and will probably be on, for the rest of my life. But anyway,
I want to jump in because I have been getting some
in.
questions privately, and you know what? I guess I'm gonna take the muzzle off. Talk about the terraces all you want. I think I'm definitely curious. What you have this? You're talking about covering the region and thinking about the San Francisco Bay Area region. What coming to Lafayette and focusing in on this one community at this point in time surprised you and didn't fit into the narrative you had while you were writing the book?
I guess what surprised me was, I guess I would say the biggest surprise was Steve Falk. So I met Steve because he was, here's how I met Steve. I called Steve for comments on a New York Times story about, it was just a profile of Sonia Trouse, which is sort of what started the whole book. And he was very against the terraces at that time. Now he was very for the housing. I mean, thank God everyone here is at least somewhat familiar with this, because explaining this to other people is so difficult. Obviously, there was the 315 unit apartment project that was proposed, and it was replaced with this 44, I believe, home project, which was then gotten rid of by initiative. And then the original project ended up moving forward, right? That's right. Steve was for the 44 home one, and Sonia had sued the city sort of saying they should build 315 instead.
Mhm.
And which was obviously sort of a gambit, but it still reflected her personality. And what I thought that what was so interesting was that, you know, he was very openly against this 315 thing. He was like, this is the wrong thing. You know, I mean, I have all these quotes in the story about that. But then over the course of the book, which I guess happened over the next, I guess I would have called him in 2016, and ultimately it was the next 4 years. So I didn't start the book for like 2 years, but my point is it was 2 years later and whatever. He really kind of became a different person. His children had moved home. They were having trouble finding housing. You know, the homeless thing got so much worse just in those 4 years. So watching, I guess, somebody change, people sort of change pretty infrequently, I've learned. And I just thought that was an interesting transformation. I mean, it actually wasn't that great for me, because I sort of thought he was going to be my city fighting Sonia anecdote. And then he just became this different, totally different person. And I guess I thought that was, I mean, I tend to gravitate towards the personal, right? I mean, and that, I guess I thought that was really an interesting thing to see, because it's just not something you see very much, and not as you're documenting it.
I think everyone likes to see personal transformation occur in a narrative. That's, you know, character development, growth. No comments on the positive or negative of Stephen Fox transformation there, but it is interesting to see that change happen. Now, I want to take it back to a question that we got near the very beginning, because it's related to, you know, Steve changing over time as he saw different evidence. And you talked about how when you moved back to the Bay, you were watching, you know, the burgeoning housing crisis back in the, you know, 2010s, early 2010s. And then you said that you looked at some data, you looked at some economic data, some of which I assume was circulating that maybe even Steve Fox looked at later. What was some of the data that made you think, you know, what you were talking about at the beginning, that there's a problem, a clear problem, and a consensus?
So people, I mean, this isn't really, it's not like one particular data set. So California grew a lot from the 50s onward, right? And nobody here is really from here, unless you're Native American. And from 1950 to 1970, the state grew massive amounts. And home prices did not rise at all. I mean, you know, but in 1970, California was roughly the median. Even the Bay Area was roughly the national median. Obviously, there was variation by neighborhood, but not the region, right? And then from 1970 to 1980, which was a huge moment for anti-growth backlash, the Sierra Club started to become a force. Ironically, the Sierra Club was more of a suburban movement. It had always been, up to the 70s, the Sierra Club had been much more of a, they focused a lot on like factory farming, pollution of waterways, you know, just like really the truly like natural world. And then they kind of changed in the 70s and became very much an organization about like backyards, like the kind of like half natural world, you know? And a lot of stuff about like lawn pesticide, you know what I mean? It was just, before that, it was a totally different, it was much more like what we call conservation. So anyway, so all that stuff happened, and housing prices in, and also there was all these downsizing, the downsizing the west side of San Francisco, LA, which has these things called dingbats, which are, they're kind of gross, but I kind of love them, but they're, you know, the classic cylinders and the carport under and the two above. Like when you drive through LA, you see a lot of those are called dingbats. They passed all these laws to prohibit that, you know, all these sorts of things. What I guess so what happened was from 1970 to 1980, housing prices exploded in the Bay Area, right? They were, and they only went up from there. They've basically never, with some minor variations, gone down. And they've only gotten much, 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 much more expensive relative to the nation. Now, Larry Katz, who is a very liberal economist, not anyone's idea of some libertarian guy, he's an economist at Harvard, and he was a big economist in the Clinton administration and has gone in and out of various other presidential administrations. When he was an undergrad at Berkeley in 1981 or something, did a speech, a whole speech, his commencement speech as the top economics student at Berkeley. He gave this whole speech on how the Bay Area had its housing problem, and it was all to do with supply, and this was a huge issue.
This is in 1981.
Yes, and actually another guy wrote a book called The Environmental Protection Hustle, which, despite the horrible name, was a very reasonable book in 1979. And he was like, the Bay Area has this huge housing problem. So this was like all out there, and people were writing about this, right? Economists and like I said, there was various presidential administrations that were talking about this. So I guess the data is really just home prices. It's also homelessness. I mean, California's rate of homelessness is there's no place in the country like this. I mean, find me one. We have more than half of the entire nation's unsheltered homeless population. And again, it's much worse than LA. I mean, LA is about a quarter of the people who live outside in America live in LA. So I mean, if you just look around, whether it's home prices or these people moving to Texas or homelessness, I mean, every single indication is that we are in, a very serious problem. I mean, I don't know how people here feel, but I mean, when people call, I mean, when the New York Times editors come out, because they always come out, I mean, obviously this is before COVID, even like, they're always like, what the hell is going on? Like, they just trip out. They're like, I have never seen anything like this, like, and I would think everybody here who has family come visit has a similar reaction, where they're just like, what is going on out here? Like, this is nuts. I mean, when my friends come to visit, I mean, they cannot believe it. And so I guess what I'm saying is that whether it's homelessness or just the rate of home prices, or we have some of the most overcrowded neighborhoods in America. We have the highest rents in the nation in San Francisco. Pick your metric. We are the worst child at the party on housing.
Yeah, this is.
So do you want to? Yeah, feel free to Q&A. Do you want to go through some of these questions, or?
Yeah. I was thinking. I mean, I was thinking.
One of the sources of information about housing laws in Lafayette, I would guess Lafayette has never passed. I'm sure I do not. If you go look up the covenants of your particular house, if it was built before 1968, and you go deep into the archives and find the full title, it's almost certainty that a number of the houses there do have racial covenants. That would have actually been 48. So, I mean, there probably were not many houses built before 48, but there must have been some. I think it's 48. I forget what it was, but the covenant thing ended before fair housing. Anyway, so I think this person has a point. I would doubt that Lafayette specifically passed any kind of, explicitly racialized, housing thing. Now, the federal government basically engineered an apartheid itself through the FHA. So the FHA had this thing called redlining, in which the federal government's own the federal government's own lending standards, basically, they would tell a bank whether or not they could get an FHA loan, but basically would not prohibited loaning in even mixed race neighborhoods. in doing so, they basically said, we want to give lower interest rates to white people. So think about that. That's a multi-trillion-dollar federal program that was specifically designed to give white people free money, basically. I mean, if you believe that lower interest rates are, you know, that's equivalent to like less money. So, and that happened, that was subsequently outlawed in '68, but it did coast for a little while. Now, but the problem is, or at least some people point out, that housing inflation was not that high. Almost as soon as redlining was outlawed, restrictive zoning became a very, a very big thing. It was not, the original suburbs were actually fairly diverse economically, actually remarkably so. But they were extremely not diverse racially. But after '68, they became much more economically, I'm not saying all suburbs are wealthy because that's not true, but like they became much more stratified along wealth, in part because of restrictive zoning and things like that. But good point. I doubt that Lafayette itself passed any kind of explicitly discriminatory housing law.
No, Lafayette wasn't around long enough to be explicitly discriminating.
Yeah.
At least.
Now, who is responsible for the housing boom and the inflated prices of homes? Do you blame the homeowners, like some people do? I don't think anyone blames the homeowners. Or do you recognize that the real estate industry is responsible for controlling? I do not believe that the real estate, I mean, I guess if you believe, okay, so let's just go through this. Let's just, without going into this question deep, let's just start at the beginning. Everybody's house is built by a developer at some point. And essentially almost everybody's house is built by a developer at some point. And that developer is usually some rich guy. If you are living in your lovely home that is your home and you bought it from the family before it, I guarantee you at some point there was some rich guy who built that home. I don't know that I'm, there are some people who think that that's the complete wrong system. We should go to a full socialist social housing system. I'm not quite there. But that is the system we have. And all of these developments in Lafayette and San Francisco and whatever, I'm saying rich guy because developers are disproportionately men, but obviously there are all sorts of people who are developers. And so at some point someone builds a home, right? And they make some profit on it and then they go away. But then that home has this very long life. It outlives them. It outlives all the neighbors. It goes through all sorts of transitions. Sometime it falls on the dumps and becomes a lower end home. Then gentrification happens and it goes through, it becomes, a higher end again, right? But the original walls of the home and the thing that was built there, it sort of lasts a while. And I guess one of the things I've sort of tried to get some perspective on as I've thought about this, this question about developers is, I guess I just sort of got to a place where I decided that I don't really necessarily love how developers get things built because it, it does involve a lot of political chicanery and whatever. But once these things are built, they kind of become our community. And we adapt to them pretty easily. And I guess I don't really know. I guess if you were to say, I don't want us to have a housing boom, I want the government to build all of our housing, that's a sort of, those thoughts follow from each other. But I don't really know, it seems sort of a little dissonant to say like, the real estate industry is responsible for everything, but all the people who built my house who went and, that's fine, right? I mean, I think that ultimately when we talk about the real estate industry, we're talking about two separate things. We're talking about a million things, but we're really talking about two things. We're talking about the market for existing housing, which is sort of your real estate brokers and your mortgage lenders and your title companies and all that. And then we're talking about the market for new housing, which is, construction workers and developers, and obviously banks and all that are involved in that too. And the market for new housing is the market that we won't allow to grow at the rate of our population, or at least we haven't historically. California's population is obviously falling now. I mean, I don't think that'll happen next year, but it happened this year. So I guess I feel like when we talk about the real estate industry, if we're talking about, say, like home flippers, but I mean, what is a home flipper doing? They're basically betting on prices rising. I actually just did a profile of a home flipper that will show up soon enough. And I mean, I talked to the guy and he was like, just very open about it. He's like, well, I can just go get a permit to renovate this house for nothing. And the market's so strong that I can just, make a couple $100,000 flipping this thing. But this guy had actually moved to ADUs and he was actually becoming kind of a developer now. And he just flat out said, oh, I make more money building now than I do raising home prices, basically, so, I mean, anyway, I'm going off in probably places that people aren't understanding, but I think that when we talk about the real estate industry inflating prices, we have to sort of ask ourselves who we're talking about and what sort of activity they're involved in and why. If you're talking about someone evicting people because rents are going up, they are doing that, but if there was higher vacancy rates, there would be more competition for renters and there would be more, more options for people. So, and I think that when we get into a discussion of who we want building it, I think that's an important discussion. Do you want a public housing program or something like that? That's certainly worth thinking about. But I guess the question is, what is the issue? Is it who is building it, or is it that anyone's building it, or what is I think you have to identify that first before you sort of start to ask yourself how you're going to reform what you're talking about. How has COVID affected California's housing crisis? Made it a lot worse. Well, so one of the reasons LA actually had a worse COVID outbreak than New York was that it has some of the most crowded housing in the country. One thing we learned pretty definitively during COVID is that dense housing is relatively safe. You spend 30 seconds with someone in an elevator, you're probably not going to get COVID. If you live in a house with 15 people, you're almost certainly going to get COVID, and one of them has COVID. So LA's outbreak, it took a while to happen, but once it happened, it was actually worse than New York's. And a big reason is crowded housing. So the other thing is too, the housing market in California has obviously gone up a lot. The home prices have gone up 30 or 40%. Rents are now, they're not quite at pre-pandemic levels, but they will be soon enough. So it's gotten a lot worse. And this sort of notion that all these people were going to leave and never come back seems to have been completely wrong. I mean, all these companies are leasing more office space and rents are going up. And anyway, we'll see if that lasts. I don't know. Are there any cities that you see as leading the way on solving the housing crisis? I get this question a lot. Basically, there's a couple different ways you could answer this. One way is you could point to places like Phoenix or Texas. They build crazy amounts of housing. They're sprawled in ways that I don't like personally. But you go to a place like Houston, they essentially do not have homelessness. Now, do they have people who have severe drug and alcohol problems and are living on the absolute edge of the world and all that? Live in substandard housing? Absolutely. But do they live outside? It's not a common sight there. And the numbers back this up. So I guess I would say if you look at some of those places like Houston and Phoenix, which again are not particularly pretty, I'm sort of a more compact urban design sort of guy. I don't love it, but I can't argue with the numbers either, right? They take care of their people in a way that we just don't. So I do think that that's one kind of example, right? I guess another kind of example is some Asian countries where they have basically almost entirely public housing. I don't think the United States is ever going to go move to a model like that. So whenever people talk about Singapore as a model, I'm like, it's interesting, but It's a nation state. It just doesn't, it doesn't translate to who we are and where we are. And so I find it to be less of a useful barometer. I think that when you look at places like us, you know, Seattle, Austin, you know, New York, Boston, even smaller places like Nashville, Minneapolis, Boise, they're all dealing with the same problem, and they're all kind of doing the same thing. They're trying to reform their zoning laws to lightly add density to single family neighborhoods. They're trying to add housing along transit corridors. They're trying to build subsidized housing. So when you go around the country, you will find pretty much an identical problem and an identical set of solutions and an identical complaints. I mean, Boston just had a big mayoral primary, and it was like all about housing. I'm looking, oh, wow. So somebody just uploaded a restrictive covenant. I don't know if it's literally from Lafayette. I assume that was the point. But in the chat, somebody put through a restrictive covenant that said that no part of said real property shall be used or occupied by any person whose blood is not entirely that of the Caucasian race, provided, however, that person not of the Caucasian race may be employed on said property by an actual Caucasian occupant solely in the capacity of servants of such occupant. Said property is intended to be for the exclusive use and occupancy of persons of the Caucasian race. I assume that's from a covenant in Lafayette. I mean, it wouldn't be surprising. I live in Rockridge. I bet you anything my house, where I live with my mixed race children, has the same thing on it. So, anyway, but that's, so it's very common. Okay. Well, Mr.
We've got time for one more question. And I can actually summarize this one because it's a longer question. There are on the affordable housing groups that want to make sure that California has inclusive housing. There are kind of two strands. There's the YIMBY side, the people who are like, let's just build more housing. And then there's also a side that also really wants to make affordable housing, that also wants to make California available, but is more skeptical of supply side policies that are focused on increasing housing policy. So it's two groups with the same good intention of creating housing for everyone, but a big disconnect in the methods that they see. What do you think is the source of that disconnect? And
I think it's a similar, well, one of the things, it's funny, I was at so there's a group of people who lean socialist who are offended. They aren't necessarily offended by supply, right? They're offended by private supply, right? So if you had a supply side solution that involved public housing or more affordable housing, generally speaking, at least the honest people you meet would be on board with that, right? So that's, I mean, there are definitely people you'll meet who say I want affordable, but they do not really mean it. But I mean, when you get into the you get deep into the like gentrification groups or whatever that are really worried about it, generally speaking, if there's an affordable, right? Because that's one thing. I think another thing, and one of the reasons you've seen such a great, I mean, there actually is a genuine coalition between very suburban homeowners and neighborhoods worried about gentrification. I think that when you live in a neighborhood, your democracy is quite a bit above you, right? Like in LA, a city council person is 200,000 people. In San Francisco, it's maybe I think like 75 or 80,000 people. It's a lot, right? And your ability to exert any kind of control over your own neighborhood really involves a lot of these zoning rules. And if somebody wants to build something near you, you can gum up the process a little bit and force the developer to kind of talk to you. And that's something a lot of different kinds of people want. So I think when you see that coalition with groups like Livable California, it is oftentimes very genuine. So that's, I think there is leaving aside the supply thing, I think there is like a natural kind of human community desire to have some control over what's happening. Now, is that changing? It might be, right? You know, like that you meet young people today and they have absorbed more housing as a value that they hold now. And, you know, those values are very hard to shake loose once people develop them. So we'll see if that holds, but I'm just saying, you know, I understand the impulse of wanting to be, you know, if somebody wants to propose something near you, you know, you can say something about it. Now, I'm not saying that that happens everywhere. You know, in New York, they have by right housing, you know, I mean, they have zoning, right? But like, if you want to propose something that's within the zoning, you kind of can't do anything. So I think there are people who, like the person in the chat, Elizabeth, I believe it's Elizabeth. Yeah, is, you know, they're very skeptical of private, you know, of people who make profit off housing. I don't really know exactly what to do with that. I mean, I was at one of these meetings in the terraces, and there was a guy who was like, you know, very wealthy and works for a corporation that's like done some pretty bad things. And he was saying all these like really vicious things about developers. And I'm not here to, you know, say developers are great or whatever, but I'm sort of sitting there and I'm like, wait, do you know who you work for? You know what I mean? I'm just like, wait, is the way like your company makes profit like so valiant? You know what I mean? Like it just sort of feels like this sort of fake anti-capitalism is fake. You know what I mean? Like, but when you meet some of these younger people who are worried about the supply side, they are some of the younger people you meet who are genuinely worried about the supply side are very, they don't like private industry and they want public housing. I think that that's a pretty radical vision that requires a lot more steps than we have at our disposal currently. But I think as a part of the long-term solution, having more public involvement in housing probably makes sense. I mean, everybody's mortgage is generally subsidized by Fannie and Freddie through the 30-year fixed anyway. So, I mean, the government subsidizes housing to a pretty large degree, even for pretty wealthy people. Let me say another thing. I don't think that supply is the answer to everything. And I know some people are going to scoff at me saying that. I mean, obviously, we have huge income inequality. You know, there was this fascinating anecdote I read about New York in the teens. They had they had a garment strike, and the rental prices in New York actually went down after the garment strike. And the reason was there was essentially two housing markets, very similar to what we have in the Bay Area right now. One was a very high-end market, and this is the rental market, right? Where they had actually pretty lower, their vacancies were higher. Landlords were more worried about, you know, giving people incentives to move in and all that sort of thing, right? And then they had a lower end housing market that was overcrowded with people and all that sort of thing. But these housing markets operated almost independently of each other. And after the garment strike, all these workers basically had more money to move to that kind of looser, higher end market. It wasn't high end by any means, but it was higher end than what they were used to. And so prices actually went down in both, because there was, essentially, if you think about it, all the people were crowded in one place and this place was empty and they spread out between them. I mean, it's not that simple, but in essence, that's what happened. And, you know, prices kind of came down universally. Right? So there are lots of other problems we have that are causing our housing problem. Income inequality. You know, we live in the society now where we've gone from a society that had like a lot of good middle-class jobs built around sort of manufacturing to a society that has a lot of really high-end jobs in sort of more knowledge-based industries, and then a lot of really low-end jobs in sort of service and, you know, retail and things like that. And not only have we become stratified along those lines, those two people have to live next to each other. There's no Starbucks in Lafayette if you can't employ it. There's no Safeway, and you know, and so our community is sort of built around this kind of you know, knowledge class and this sort of service class, and they have to live in fairly close proximity. So, I guess what I'm saying is that there are a lot of problems beyond just supply that have to do with, globalization. They have to do with how expensive it is to build housing. They have to do with all these different things. And I think we should be, whether it's public subsidies or obviously having better jobs in America and higher wages would be good. So all those things will help us become a better, fairer, more equal society. But when you start asking the question, what can a local government do? I feel like housing is pretty much the only thing in their control, at least the only big thing. You could play around with minimum wage and stuff like that, which is good, right? But I feel like housing is the one thing we have in our control. I mean, one of the things that always frustrates me is you'll go to a city council, I mean, not in Lafayette, but like in San Francisco, and they're like, we're going to stop income inequality. And I'm like, that's like not the San Francisco Board of Supervisors jurisdiction, there's some things they can do, but when they look at their housing problem, I'm like, you own that. You can do all sorts of stuff for that. You know what I mean? It's like that lever is right there for you to pull, whereas all these other levels have to do with, again, these things that are above you. So I guess one of the reasons I've sort of focused on housing as I've looked at this regional area is it's like sort of like look at places like Houston or Phoenix or other places, like they don't have this problem, and it's not because the federal government gave them more money than us, and it's not because, it's because they just had a different policy. And so I do think that when we think about, I think that housing is one of these things that is really, it's one of the few things the local government actually can do. I probably did not at all answer your question there, but I think the reason people are skeptical of supply is that they're skeptical of developers for good reason, right? And then I think the other reason is, so somebody's talking about trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics is not the same thing as trickle-down of a good. So when we think of trickle-down economics, basically trickle-down economics is the belief that if you lower taxes for rich people, would somehow trickle down to middle-class people. That turns out to be completely wrong. But that's not the same as having a good that's undersupplied and then making more of the good. Right? Like if we had a food shortage, if we said, let's make more food, people wouldn't call that trickle down. They would call it making more food. They're not the same thing. Now there are legitimate questions about what kind of supply are you building, right? When people start building like $10, $20 million condos that truly are just for kind of an investment, I think there is all sorts of reasons to take a hard look at that sort of thing. Places like Vancouver have done vacancy taxes, and they've tried to do some foreign buyer taxes. Although they've all worked. They've all done something. So there's a lot of experimentation happening around the country. Elizabeth is asking a lot of questions, but
so we're gonna. I would say
no problem. I'm sorry.
I would love to hear more because this is amazing.
You're letting me go on too much.
It's amazing, but we do need to move on to the next part of the event. But before we do, can everyone just give a round of applause for Conor, because this is so informative.
Sorry we rambled, but you know what? It's a housing group, so
yeah. We love to learn from you, and a lot of great insight there. We hope that you will cover Lafayette sometime soon.
I might have to hang it up on Lafayette, but
well, we're glad to see you continuing.
Thank you for having me. I have thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody who bought the book or read the book. Thank you to you too.
Yes, snaps. Now, before we close, Conor's talking about what you can do at the local level. And we would like to share some of what Inclusive Lafayette is doing.
So wait, just real quick, is my portion of this done?
Yeah, I was about to send you a message.
Oh,
you could
no problem. All right, thank you.
You're
Sorry, I had
enjoy.
yes.
Go help your daughter.
Yes.
Play her video games.
Yes. Bye.
Take care, Connor. So yeah, we want to talk about some of the things that Inclusive Lafayette is doing to try and make housing more accessible at the local level. We have 4 committees that focus on different aspects of our work. I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you in a minute. And they're going to, right now, what we're going to do for the next few minutes, we're going to have about 10 minutes of the committees presenting about what they do, who they are, what they're working on. And then we're going to do breakout rooms that people can choose to join to go a little deeper into what the committees are working on and how you can potentially get involved with them. So if you don't want to go in a committee, I'll be here hanging out so you can chat with me. But give it a listen. I'm going to pass the mic over to Nicole, who will talk about community organizing.
Hi, so I'm going to give my spiel about my committee. I'm the lead for the Community Organizing Committee. So our goals are to increase civic engagement in the community, work on community building, and building trust within our board and the general town. So that's basically what we do. And I would love to have you in my breakout room. And with that, I'll pass it on to Casey.
Just quick, I want to give a quick shout out to Nicole also, who was the lead on organizing this event, brought us all together here. So if you've liked what you've seen so far, you can help plan future things. Sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to give that shout out. Take it away, Casey.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hey, everyone. Hope you're having a great night. I'm Casey. I'm the lead for the Communications Committee at Inclusive Lafayette. So really the goal of our committee is just increasing public awareness and support for our different priorities as an organization through our different digital channels. So this includes social media. We have a Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram account as well. This includes creating graphics for all those posts, maintaining an email program as well. So if you're not signed up or following any of those accounts, make sure you do so. I can paste them in chat in a bit. But if you're also interested in being part of formulating our voice as an organization or making graphics or anything like that, please hang out with me in our breakout room. And I'm going to pass the mic to Chris for research.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I'm the lead for the research committee. We focus on looking at local and state housing policy and how it affects Lafayette, and try to write op-eds, letters to public officials, and both internally, externally try to shape policy and strategic goals. Who's next? Yes, and next will be Gabe.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gabe. I am the lead with the Partnerships Committee. Our main focus is on working with and cooperating with different organizations to try and work together and find common interests where we can work to achieve some of the things that we want to see. And so that looks like working with other organizations in La Marinda, in the East Bay more generally, things of that nature. I would love to see you in my breakout room. We would love to have more folks on the committee. So that is something that I would love to see happen in just a minute here. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Jeremy.